I was staying at a hotel in Chicago, Illinois during a business trip, and I was going to stay for the whole weekend. It was an older hotel, one that still used small keys rather than keycards to enter the rooms. I didn't mind. It seemed like a nice getaway from the onslaught of technology. When I checked into the hotel, it was completely packed. A nasty storm had rolled in, stranding many tourists and canceling flights. No more rooms were available, and many people were being turned away because of the lack of vacancy. When I approached the front desk to check in, I noticed that all the keys for the rooms on the 8th floor were still on the wall. Not a single key was missing. Seemed odd that an entire floor would be vacant when so many people were all clambering to check in and get their rooms. I could see the clerk was stressing out and he was ready to just give up and go home, so I tried to lighten the mood a little bit. Kinda weird, isn't it? What is? The clerk asked. How everybody on the 8th floor is missing. The clerk gave me an odd look and his face paled. What do you know about the 8th floor? He replied in a serious tone. What? Oh, nothing, I answered honestly, a little embarrassed that my attempt to lighten the mood backfired. I just noticed that all the keys for the 8th floor were still behind the desk. The clerk blushed a little and tried to laugh it off. Oh yes, I see now. He went back to checking me in and handing me my keys to the room on the 9th floor. Enjoy your stay. I will. Thanks. I awkwardly accepted the key and grabbed my bag, heading for the elevator. Just like the lobby, the elevator was also packed. It was difficult to stand next to so many strangers so close by, let alone enter and exit a small car. I struggled to reach and press the button for the 9th floor, but I managed to see over the crowd of people and reach the button panel. It was then that I noticed that the button seemed to be missing a floor. 8. That's funny, I thought out loud. I wonder why there's no button for the 8th floor. But no one in the elevator reacted. They either didn't care or they were too preoccupied and didn't hear me. Once I finally got to my floor, I checked into my room. I took a moment to relax and unwind on the bed. I had to give a presentation tomorrow and I needed to be alert. I decided to go to bed early that night and to practice my speech a few times to make sure I sounded confident. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror as I practiced my sales pitch a few times. A strange groaning sound from the room beneath me got my attention. It sounded like there was a man in pain or upset. I ignored it and continued my practicing. The groaning from the lower floor continued on, growing louder and louder by the minute. Angrily, I stomped on the floor as hard as I could and shouted, "Hey buddy, you okay down there?" There was no response, and the groaning had stopped. Satisfied that the man realized he was making too much noise, I continued to practice my speech. Just as I finished the first half of my speech, the groaning began again. But this time it was much louder and angrier. If this was going to go on all night, there was no way I'd be prepared for my presentation tomorrow. So I knocked on my neighbor's door and was greeted with a grumpy response from a young woman and her new husband. Excuse me. I politely tried to engage in conversation. Do you guys hear that noise in the room below us? No. The woman sounded more confused than grouchy at this point. We haven't heard anything until you pounded on our door. Oh, sorry. I apologized, once again feeling embarrassed. Must be the pipes of something then. I tried to think of a possible alternate explanation so I didn't seem like a crazy person. Well, I'll just call management then. Sorry, have a good night. The couple shut the door and locked it. I returned to my room where the groaning noise continued. I picked up the phone on the small table next to the bed and called the front desk to complain about the noise. When I mentioned that it seemed to be coming from a room beneath me, a room on the 8th floor, the man who answered the phone suddenly got quiet. Sir, there's no one checked in that room.
It must be someone on the ninth floor.
No, I tried to sound confident. It's not coming from the walls, it's coming from the floor below me.
Well,
The man sounded rattled, and I could sense that he was trying to think of an explanation just to get me to hang up.
I'll call in the maintenance crew. It's probably just a leaky pipe or a problem with the heating ducts.
Yeah, I'm sure it is, I said as I hung up the phone, not believing him for an instant. The groaning was growing louder and angrier by the minute. I put my hands to my ears to try and block out the sound, but it wasn't enough. I walked back into the bathroom and turned on the shower and the sink full blast, hoping the running water would drown out the noise, and it only helped a little bit. I sat on the bathroom floor trying to think of a way to get some sleep, but I didn't have any other options. All the rooms were full, I couldn't request a new room, and there was no way another hotel would have any vacancy during this storm. Suddenly, the pipes on the shower began rattling violently. The shaking was so strong that it caused the shower to sputter as it continued to run. The sound was like thunder inside the walls, and combined with the thunder outside the hotel as well as the pouring rain, sounded like there was a freight train barreling down the tracks right at me. I left my room, grabbing my keys and my phone. I made my way to the elevator so I could lodge a complaint in the lobby. As soon as I stepped inside the elevator, I remembered that the 8th floor couldn't be accessed. The number wasn't an option. I then remembered that all the keys for the 8th floor were still behind the desk at the lobby. How could anyone check into a room on the 8th floor? Curious, I exited the elevator and made my way for the stairs. I walked down the stairwell from the 9th floor and directly onto the 7th. But that's impossible, I told myself. I walked back up the stairs and double-checked the floor number. Sure enough, just like the elevator, there was no floor 8. I walked up and down the staircase a few times trying to figure out what was going on, when I noticed a small imperfection on the wall next to the doorway that led onto the 7th floor. I checked and realized that it was a gap between a hidden door and its door frame. Using my fingertips, I pried open the door and found a small staircase leading back up one flight, up to the otherwise non-existent 8th floor. It was dark and dusty, like no one had used this passageway in years. I used the screen on my phone to light my way as I made my way up through the secret staircase. There was another door at the top of the stairs. It wasn't sealed away or hidden. It was actually easily accessible. The door was numbered 8. Opening the door, I found myself on the 8th floor and alone. I could just feel it. There was no one else on this floor with me. It was dark in the long hallway. Not even the exit signs were lit up. I continued to use my phone as I walked down the hallway, checking each door as I passed. They were all locked, that is, except for one door. The unlocked door was for the room directly beneath mine. I knocked once, just trying to make sure no one was secretly checked into the room, but no one replied. I opened the door, still trying to figure out why this door was the only one unlocked, and found myself standing in a room that mirrored my own perfectly. The lights didn't work. I tried the switch a few times, but there was no power on this floor. I don't know what compelled me to call out, but I did. Hello? Is anyone in here? Nothing responded. I went over to the phone and picked it up, but the line was dead. The amount of dust and cobwebs told me that there was no one in this room, and no one had been for quite some time, but I still felt the need to look around. I opened the door to the bathroom and was taken aback by what I saw in the room. There was a bathtub in the room, unlike mine, which had a shower, but the tub was full of water. The water was at the top of the tub, threatening to spill over at any moment. I stepped closer, still using my phone to light my way, when I noticed a dark figure in the tub. It looked like a man. A dead man. Shining my phone over the tub, and I stared down into the still water as if in a trance, trying to look at the dead man's face. As my senses slowly came back to me, the man's eyes opened and he looked directly at me. I fell back onto the floor, dropping my phone and losing my light. A splash came from the tub and I could feel cold water spilling onto the floor, soaking my clothes. The sound of a heavy, wet footstep exited the tub. The second footstep was all the motivation I needed to get up and run. I bolted from my room, not caring about my phone or who the man was, and ran down the hall back through the door from whence I came. I ran down the stairs all the way down to the lobby and didn't stop until I collided with the front desk. Breathlessly, I tried to tell the clerk what I had seen, and that we needed to call the police. The clerk, who looked scared, not so much because there was a dead body in the hotel, but more like he was afraid of getting fired, escorted me to the manager's office behind the desk. "Sir," the clerk tried to sound calm and reassuring. "What did you see exactly?" I told him what I had seen and what I had heard. I showed him the wet spots on my clothing where the tub's water splashed onto me. I didn't care if I got arrested for trespassing or causing a disturbance. I had to tell someone what had happened to me. The clerk listened intently to my story, not blinking, not looking away. When I finished, he got up and walked over to a large filing cabinet. He opened an unmarked drawer and began thumbing through an extensive collection of files. Pulling a file from the drawer, he opened it up and pulled out a very old newspaper article. "Is this the man you saw?" he asked as he handed me the article. I looked at the clipping and felt my stomach drop. It was him. That was the man. The clerk sat down across from me and smiled a little bit. "You're not the first to have seen him." That was not the reaction I was expecting. "Read the article," he said. The article told the story of a man who had gone away on business and returned home to discover that his pregnant wife had been cheating on him and that the baby wasn't his. Heartbroken and betrayed, the man checked into the hotel and never left his room. He was heard crying and wailing in heartbreak for 3 days before he finally stopped. When the maid entered his room to clean, she found his body in the bathtub. He had taken his own life, drowning himself after ingesting many sleeping pills. Is this why you won't let anyone check in on the 8th floor? Because of him? I asked, feeling more at ease knowing that I wasn't crazy. "No," the clerk admitted. "He's only one of the reasons we don't let anyone check in on the 8th floor." "What do you mean?" The clerk just smirked again. "See that filing cabinet?" "Yeah." "And that unmarked drawer at the bottom?" "Yes." I answered again. "What of it?" "That drawer contains every reason we don't let anyone check in on the 8th floor. Ever since this hotel opened in 1873, we've had people die in very unusual ways. Always on the 8th floor." "That's strange," I commented, feeling a little queasy. "What's stranger is the fact that no two deaths were the same, and no two deaths ever took place in the same room. Each room on the 8th floor has housed a tragic death, and each room has been reportedly haunted by the dead." Hearing this sent a shiver up my spine. "What? How? Are you trying to tell me the 8th floor is cursed? Anyone who checks into a room is going to die or be haunted?" The clerk simply bowed his head. "It's not just the rooms that have seen death. Maintenance workers have died attempting simple repairs. One man was electrocuted while trying to fix the lights. Another fell down the elevator shaft to his death. A maid was found dead, hanging by her neck at the end of the hallway. I sat transfixed in fear at the story the clerk had just told me, and I didn't know what to believe. But shouldn't we call the police? I saw a body. Everyone does, the clerk explained. Even the police have seen the bodies, but have never been able to explain the situations. I didn't know what to do. It was late, I was exhausted, and I didn't want to cause any more disturbances. Reluctantly, I returned to my room. I took the elevator and held my breath as the car passed by the sealed-off 8th floor. As I was approaching my room, I noticed something wet on the floor outside my door. It was my cell phone, the one that I had dropped on the 8th floor. My wife and I moved into our new apartment just a few months ago. It was a downgrade from our previous home, as we had lived in a large but quaint cottage. It had been my wife's dream home for the 3 years we lived there. We didn't want to leave, but it was a necessary step for us. You see, Jessica and I used to live down south. Everything was going well for a while, but my law firm decided to give me a promotion out of the blue. It was unexpected, but very much appreciated. Unfortunately, the job entailed transferring to another one of our many locations. The one in question was located in New England. We spoke long and hard on the matter, and after much deliberation, Jess agreed on the move. It's important to note that the dollar doesn't stretch as far up north as it does down south. It's also harder to find employment. That's why we were downgrading our living space. Until Jess could find another job, we would have to suffer a bit. At least, that's the way she looked at it. Tensions were high for the first few weeks after the move. I could tell Jess was irritable. She missed our old house, our old friends, and working a steady job. She had nothing to do with her time, so she was bored out of her mind constantly. This eventually led to many fights. For a while, it seemed like we would never settle in. About a month after the move, things actually started looking up. Jess found temporary work as a part-time editor at a local TV station. She loved the work and couldn't have been happier with her coworkers. Seemed like everything was going fine. Not perfect, but fine. This is when the sleep talking began. It was to be expected, and honestly, I'm surprised it didn't start up sooner. You see, my wife's a restless sleeper whenever there's a big change in her life, good or bad. It happened when we got married, when we moved into our first home, and when she had the miscarriage. I'll touch more on that later. Jess knows she sleep talks, as I used to bring it up from time to time. I would laugh each morning, recalling the weird thing she said the night before. This always made her uncomfortable. She seemed to be embarrassed by it. That's why, after her first night of sleep talking in our new apartment, I kept my mouth shut. The sleep talking went on for a couple of weeks. It was at this time that her temp job at the TV station came to an end. Without a job to keep her mind off of things, her nightly outbursts became much worse. She began screaming at odd times during the night, in which I would be forced to calm her down. One night, her screams turned into tears. As she was crying, she said something I'll never forget.
I wish you were dead.
I knew my wife was asleep, but as I sat there by her side, calming her as best I could, I felt the need to press the matter. Who do you wish was dead, sweetie? To my surprise, she actually responded.
You.
This caught me off guard. It's a strange thing to want your husband dead, and even stranger while you're asleep. Why? I asked.
You're ruining my life.
Those 4 words cut deep. Whether she actually meant them or they were merely the product of a tired mind, those were the kind of words that demanded self-reflection. I wondered for a moment if I truly was ruining her life, or at least if I were to blame for her night terrors. My wife remained silent for the rest of the night. I know this because I never went to bed after. Contemplation and worry kept me from a good night's rest. I didn't believe for a second that my wife actually wanted me dead, but her late-night antics were certainly a cause for concern. Between the screaming episodes and the morbid dialogue, this was the worst her condition had ever been. The next morning, I came pretty damn close to telling her about what had happened, but I kept thinking about how'd she react and what she would say to me. It was too much. I didn't want to burden her any more than I already had, especially after she had just been laid off. In light of all this, I kept my mouth shut. The following night, the screams were gone. This was a comfort, but a fleeting one. Out of the blue, just as I was about to shut my eyes and call it a night, the sleep talking commenced once again.
Sometimes I think about how I do it.
I chalked the statement up to pure dream-induced nonsense. But then she continued.
While you're asleep in bed, I'll get up and go to the kitchen.
I didn't know what she was talking about. But as she kept speaking, it dawned on me. There were some moments of inaudible gibberish, but from the bits and pieces that were fluent, I could paint a pretty good picture of what she was saying.
Reach into, grab knife, over and over again. Blood oozing off the bed. Can't ruin my life anymore.
My wife was describing her plan to murder me. As deeply unsettling as this was, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. It was just a dream after all. Nothing more. I can't say I haven't done or said some weird things in my own dreams. Things I would never do in real life. Jess was mad at me over the move, and she was just working out some of her frustrations while she slept. At least that's what I told myself. The sleep talking continued for a few weeks. I hoped that her midnight venting sessions were doing her some good, but without a degree in psychology, I couldn't be certain. All I could do was listen to her ramble on about offing me each night and wait for her condition to run its course. The longest her sleep talking has ever lasted was about a month, so it was safe to assume that it would all be over soon. A month passed. Then 2. Jess didn't let up. Every night it was the same routine. Either incoherent nonsense or babblings about how she'd like to hurt me. It was getting old, frankly. But one night changed everything. As my wife slept, she uttered some words that tore right through my heart.
I lost my baby because of you.
My emotions swirled about and formed a sour concoction that rested in the pit of my stomach. This time, I had to know what she meant. "What do you mean?" I said to her. There was a brief moment of silence, but eventually Jess offered up an answer. There was some more gibberish mixed in, but she was able to get her point across.
You made me want kids. Now, I'm alone.
This struck a nerve and caused a few tears to roll down my cheek. It was my idea to try and have a kid. Jess never wanted children, but she made herself want to for me. That's why, after the miscarriage, I was surprised to find her absolutely devastated. I had no clue how much she had warmed up to the idea of having a baby. My tears were interrupted by more sleep talking. Of the worst variety.
I will kill you. I promise.
That was the last thing she said all night. It's been roughly a week since my wife made that promise. As disturbing as that threat was, I could have easily brushed it off with the rest, assuming it too was the product of stress and was nothing for me to worry about. Unfortunately, I can't stop worrying about it. Jess is scaring the shit out of me. I'm now taking short naps and sleeping with one eye open. And it's all because of one thing. Now, my wife has started sleepwalking. You know what sucks? Being the best in the world at something and it being utterly unremarkable. I'm an incredible mime. I can fake climbing a rope like you wouldn't believe. But mimes don't rake in the cash like they used to. And busking is hard. On a good day, I might make $30. No matter how many walls I'd walk into or jump ropes I'd skip, my act just wasn't making any money. I was going to lose my apartment. I'm crediting my desperation for me not noticing how creepy the man was. I guess when your diet mostly consists of 99-cent tacos, you don't think twice when you get offered magic gloves. But he said they'd make me put on my most memorable show ever. So I took them without a second thought. The next day, I set down my money bucket, slipped on the gloves, hit the play button on the stereo, and got to work. I started with the classic rope climb. Then something amazing happened. As I closed my hands around the invisible rope, my fingers latched onto something solid. I could actually feel rope in my hands. I gave it a strong tug. My feet came off the ground and I just hung there, dangling from a rope that wasn't even there. It was astounding. And I was rewarded by the numerous sounds of clapping and applause. A small crowd had gathered, staring in wonder as I hung in midair. So I continued my show. I sat on chairs that weren't there, leaned impossibly against walls. I even rode an invisible bike through an ever-increasing crowd to uproarious cheers, and my money bucket was overflowing with cash. And then I decided to try the timeless move. The invisible box. I crouched down, stretched out my hands, feeling the walls all around me. I faked hysterics as I pounded on the walls. The crowd loved it. I gave a flourish of my hands to the crowd and got up from my crouch. And then, my head slammed into the ceiling. I stifled a yell, and the crowd just laughed. I put my hands out and pushed on the invisible walls, but they wouldn't budge. I began to pound and kick and slam myself against the walls of my invisible prison, but nothing was working. I tried to take the gloves off, but it was like they were fused to my skin. I immediately gave up on my mime act and yelled for help, but my mouth produced no sound. Then, the walls began moving inward. I tried to brace myself against them as the box grew smaller and smaller. The crowd cheered loudly as I pushed with all my might, trying desperately to stop the wall's terrible advance until I could feel it on every side of me, squeezing in on me like a vice. And as my breath left me and I could feel my bones begin to crack, and as the jubilant laughter of the crowd turned into terrified screaming, I couldn't help but think that this was definitely going to be my most memorable show I ever had. So I discovered the meaning of life. Or at least, that's what my eager customers are led to believe. You see, 2 or 3 times a month, I post a listing titled The Meaning of Life to various auction sites. I couple it with a sappy picture of a sunset or rainbow, and a description that reads, "All views are subjective. Results may vary." Most people wouldn't even bat an eye at such a ridiculous listing. But there are some gullible folks out there that will take the bait. When the bidding ends, I usually take home anywhere from $5 to $12. After I receive the money, I ship out the item. What is the item, you might ask? Well, I scribble down an inspirational quote or life lesson onto a piece of paper and mail it out in your standard letter-sized envelope. The quotes are usually from famous writers, historical figures, or hell, even the Bible. Some of them include, "If light is in your heart, you will find your way home." Quoted by Rumi. "People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel." Quoted from Maya Angelou. "It's never too late to be what you might have been." Quoted from George Eliot. And that's it. One stamp, a drop in the mailbox, and my work is done. It's as simple as that. You might call me a scammer or a con artist, or perhaps even a plagiarist. And in truth, you are correct. I'm taking advantage of the naive people out there who are probably just looking for a sense of purpose in life. Also, I can make a quick buck. But I'd like to think most people know it's fake and purchase it just to see what I'll send them. Besides, I'm a bachelor right out of college. As long as I can make a small dent in my phone bill and eat a packet of ramen each night, I'll sleep just fine. As you might imagine, I receive quite a bit of hate mail. I've learned to ignore angry emails and private messages on auction sites. As soon as I see it's from one of my customers, it gets deleted. I do, however, receive the occasional snail mail. It's unavoidable, as my P.O. box is listed on all of the envelopes I send out. It would be pretty easy for me to toss these letters in the trash with the rest of my junk mail, but I never can. Something about receiving a physical letter from someone, good or bad, compels me to read it. Anyone who takes the time to write one deserves to have their voice heard, even if I don't really care for what they have to say. The more and more letters I receive, the more and more amused I am by them. To paint a better picture, here's a few of my favorite quotes from the fan mail I've received over the years. "You're nothing but a glorified fortune cookie service. You're going to rot in hell for the sins you've committed. Mark my words. You're a real piece of shit, you know that?" It's reached a point where reading these letters have become the highlight of my week. I've even tacked some of the better ones up on a corkboard in my bedroom. You might think that's sick and a little messed up, but I think it's amusing. Not all the letters I receive are bad, though. There's one guy by the name of Big Red, like the gum, I guess. That's all he ever writes above his return address, who mails me constantly. He sends me inspirational quotes in exchange for mine. I assume he's a repeat customer who actually enjoys paying for and receiving cheerful messages in his mailbox every now and again. The first quote Big Red ever sent me was, "The fear of death follows from the fear of life. A man who lives fully is prepared to die at any time." By Mark Twain. Though there was nothing else in the message, this was a great first impression, as Mark Twain is one of my favorite authors. The quote was much appreciated. As such, I hung it up next to the hate mail on my corkboard. Another thing that's great about the quotes Big Red sends me is that I can regift them to my customers. Saves me time from looking up quotes online. It's true that I could send out the same quote more than once, but that just isn't my style. I like to think there's a good chunk of people out there who enjoys the sayings I send them, and who might actually be repeat customers. If so, I have to have a little variety. Some of the things Big Red sends me, however, are not re-gift material. Some quotes he sends are morbid and depressing, and other times he'll send me small packages containing little trinkets that I have no use for. It's a little weird, but I figure the guy is depressed and just needs a friend. Maybe the quotes he bought from me were the only thing he had to look forward to each morning. Perhaps the things he sends me are his way of saying thank you. To me, it's validation that what I'm doing isn't completely sleazy. But here's where things get weird. Today, I received another envelope from Big Red. I actually smiled when I pulled it out of my P.O. box. His letters and gifts were just as much, if not more, of a highlight to my week than the endlessly entertaining hate mail I get. Upon opening the envelope, my smile vanished. Inside was a photograph of me, taken up close through my bedroom window. On the back of the photograph was another one of Big Red's quotes. "You look so alone. Where's the meaning in your life?" My life, for lack of a better term, is average. Nothing really remarkable or astounding has ever happened to me in the short time I've been on this planet. I did win a soda from a bottle cap prize once years ago, but that was about it. I've never been in an accident, never experienced trauma, never even kissed a girl. I'm still in high school, so I try to tell myself that, even though I'm missing out on a lot of things, that there's still a lot of time left. A little bit about me. My hobbies include watching sci-fi shows, reading, writing, and upgrading my personal computer, which I've had since I was about 13. My parents work constantly, but we always seem to be pinching pennies to scrape by. So whenever a birthday or a holiday comes around, instead of asking for a whole new system, I just ask for a much needed piece of computer hardware to keep my system updated. As you might imagine, my social status is nothing to write home about. I have a couple of friends, though they only interact with me during lunch at school. My love life is completely non-existent. Last year, I was goaded into talking to a girl I had a crush on, but when I walked up to her, I was at a loss for words, so I ended up just awkwardly staring at her. But my personal life isn't what this story is about. A few days ago, after being hounded by my mother to get some fresh air, I went for a walk to the nearby park. It was one of those small children's parks, few swings, a couple of slides, not much else. I felt pretty strange walking there by myself, to be honest. Usually the only reason teenagers go to the park is to either score some drugs or score some love. But I didn't have any other places to go since school had been out for the summer. As I unenthusiastically sat on the swing, kicking my feet in the dirt, I was calculating how much time would be sufficient before I could return and spend the rest of the night on my computer. After about 20 minutes sitting by myself, the sun began its descent. I felt like I had inhaled enough fresh air for one lifetime. As I rose from the swing, I noticed a lone picnic table nearby. The table itself wasn't what captivated my attention. There was something on top of it. Light from the falling sun bounced off this object and glinted in my eyes. I made my way over to it, and I immediately knew exactly what it was. It was a small black flash drive with a chrome stripe running along its side. Picking it up, I inspected it for any markings of an owner. When I saw none, I spent a minute looking around to see if anyone would be returning to claim it. After seeing nobody in the area, I slid the drive in my pocket and made my way home. When I arrived, my mother yelled at me to do my chores.
which annoyed me because she just yelled at me to spend more time outside. After finishing up my chores and eating dinner, I was finally able to relax in the sanctity of my own room. For about the first hour, I completely forgot about the drive in my pocket. I spent my time browsing websites and staring at the new photos my crush had just posted. It wasn't until I got up to grab a glass of water that I remembered the flash drive in my pocket. Rushing back to my room, I sat down at my desk and retrieved the drive. As I was about to plug it into my computer, I hesitated for a moment. I began having inquisitive thoughts, such as, why did someone leave a flash drive in a park? This thing could probably have a load of viruses on it. What if it had top secret government files on it, and the FBI were about to kick open my door? My curiosity, however, got the better of me, and I plugged the drive into my computer. Suddenly, nothing happened. I waited for a moment to see if the drive would be recognized, but nothing came up. I then went to my computer's directory and tried to find the external drive, though when I found the correct slot, it was blank. Thinking that the flash drive must have been defective, I shut down my PC and went to sleep. That night, I awoke at around 4 a.m. to a strange noise. It sounded like the whirring of computer fans combined with a series of clicking noises. Groggily, I turned my attention towards my PC. I wasn't sure what I was seeing at first. It seemed like my computer was opening files and closing them rapidly. Panic began to set in as I realized my original fear might have been correct, that the drive had a virus on it and it somehow turned my computer back on. I rushed over to my computer and my first instinct was to hit the escape key. When I did, the computer stopped whatever it was doing and seemed to go back to normal. I searched through a few of my files and ran an antivirus program, but nothing seemed to be wrong with it. Just as I was about to write it off as a weird glitch, I saw it. The previously blank drive now had a name: External Flash Drive 1. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if it had simply needed time to download the appropriate drivers to recognize the drive. I clicked on it, and nothing happened. I then decided to right-click and inspect its properties. What I saw made little sense to me. In the spot where it showed the allotted space on the drive, the zeros seemed to go on forever. Something felt odd about seeing this number on a flash drive, so my natural reaction was to open Google and punch the number in. What I found both shocked and amazed me. There was somehow 1 zettabyte's worth of space on this drive. To put that into a little perspective for you, 1 zettabyte is roughly 1 billion terabytes. The average PC uses only 1 terabyte of storage. The word impossible rang out through my head so loud it was almost hard to think straight. That's when I started to feel slightly nervous, because earlier when I checked the properties of the flash drive and I saw the space, the entire drive was completely full. I began thinking about my other theory that this had to be some type of government technology that somebody had stolen. I was in mid-thought when my computer began acting strangely again. It once again started opening and closing random files rapidly. I watched it for a moment before clicking the escape key. This time, however, nothing happened. The computer just continued its operation. After a few minutes of watching, a new window popped up on my screen and stayed there. It was an opened file folder with only a single text document inside. The document was titled, "Read Me." I hovered my cursor over it for a moment before double-clicking it. I was bracing myself for the fireball this file might turn my computer into, but what popped up surprised me. It was a simple 2-paragraph note. I'll relay what it said. If you are reading this, then you have made a grave mistake. I have dedicated my life to the study of technology. Through many years of trial and error, I have finally perfected the ultimate artificial intelligence. We had completed this program as a testament of our knowledge, but we did not think ourselves gods among men, nor did we foolishly think we could control this program. We managed to transfer the program safely onto this special flash drive. I know I should have destroyed it immediately, but that would have been like asking me to kill my own child. I have programmed this automated response in the unlikely event someone were to come into possession of this flash drive. Destroy the flash drive before it's too late. My name is Thomas, and this is a warning. I stared at the message for a minute before the reality of what I was reading actually set in. Just as I was about to rip out the drive from my computer, a new window popped up on my screen. It was a new text file with the title, "Thank you." The message only had 3 words. 3 words that will haunt me for as long as I live. I am free. Quickly, I clicked onto the drive's properties once again, and I felt my stomach fall through the floor, and tears began to form in my eyes. I thought I was an average kid. Nothing remarkable has ever happened to me in my entire life. I stared at the allotted space on the flash drive. The entire 1 zettabyte drive was now completely empty. If you are listening to this, then it is because I have made a grave mistake. My entire life, I've never been in an accident, never experienced trauma. I never even kissed a girl. But I think I may have single-handedly destroyed the entire world. My name is John, and this is not a warning. This is an apology. A few years ago, I got into visiting scary locales, cemeteries, abandoned buildings, etc. Since then, I've met my wife, who indulges me and joins in on these little endeavors. We had exhausted all of the potentially spooky places around the city we live in and its surrounding areas. Then, after talking to people with similar interests, we decided to take a mini road trip with the sole intention of visiting a specific place. It's located in the state west of ours, about 10 hours from our home. The name of this place, or so it has been called, is Babyland. If you think that sounds like A, a place to buy things for newborns, B, a themed restaurant for little kids, C, a daycare, or D, a place where gross atrocities are committed against children, you're not alone. I didn't think it sounded particularly creepy, but I was kind of off-put when the people we heard about it from were extremely reluctant to divulge any information about it, much less tell us where it was. After a few weeks of poking, prodding, and ultimately begging, we got one of the people to give us directions. We looked up Babyland online and found nothing related to the supposedly creepy location to which we were headed. All we were going off of was the suspiciously limited word of someone we didn't really know, aside from having a single common interest. The reluctance of the rest of the, I don't want to say ghost hunting community, because that's not really what we do. I guess I'll just call it thrill-seeking. The thrill-seeking community admittedly made both me and my wife Kimmy that much more interested. We had timed our drive so we would arrive at the destination around 10 p.m. It was located on an unmarked dirt road about 20 miles outside the nearest town. When we asked how we would know we found the place, we were told we would have no doubt about it. Trees began getting more dense the further down the dirt road we went, and eventually we couldn't see the moon or the stars anymore. Shortly after that, a previously non-existent fog became so thick that I couldn't see more than 3 or 4 feet in front of the car. Somehow, I knew as soon as that fog thickened to the point of near zero visibility that we were in the right place. I looked at my wife, and in what seemed like a movie-esque moment, she simply nodded her head in silent agreement. I then pulled to the side of the road and parked the car. My wife and I got our flashlights and proceeded down the road on foot. We didn't even make it more than 10 feet before our first glimpse into why this area was referred to as Babyland presented itself. The fog was so thick that even with the flashlight, I walked right into it. A baby stroller was standing upright in the middle of the road. It was an old-fashioned cover of Rosemary's Baby style stroller. I looked inside it, but it was empty. A few steps farther and we found that the road was, quite literally, littered with strollers, cribs, and playpens of all types and styles. It got to the point that they completely blocked the road. I talked to Kimmy, and we both felt like there was more to this area than just the abundance of baby shower gifts that were obstructing the road. So we went off to the side, into the trees. Hanging from every few branches were mobiles, each lightly spinning from the gentle wind blowing through the forestry. We took caution with each step, if for no other reason than we couldn't see anything in front of us, even with our flashlights. Though it could be attributed to the fact that we were in the middle of nowhere, we were surrounded by an absolute, almost ear-shattering silence. Even the wind didn't make a sound. This silence was broken by a deafening howl that we both screamed at, as it was a noise we immediately recognized. It was the sound of a baby crying. It took me a moment to register what had happened, but when I did, I was considerably less frightened. I had stepped on a baby doll. Kimmy and I both offered one another an uncomfortable laugh, and we kept going. We found the floor of the woods to be lousy with both intact dolls as well as scattered limbs of different dolls. Shining our lights upwards towards the trees above us revealed dolls perched on branches, many of which had no eyes, stationed above us like observant owls. It's a difficult feeling to describe, but the fact that they were eyeless made it feel like they were watching us more intently than they would have been if they had eyes. As the mobiles spun and the eyeless dolls looked on us, we walked further into the woods, until we eventually heard another familiar sound in the distance. We stopped and listened intently until we were certain of what we were hearing. It was the crackling of a fire. Assuming we weren't the only ones in Babyland on that particular night, we decided to head towards the fire and make ourselves known, so as not to spark a potentially dangerous confrontation. As we continued walking and the sound of the crackling fire got louder, we announced our presence, but we were met with no response. Eventually, through the fog, we saw the orange glow of a fire close to the ground. We were only about 20 feet away from the fire, but the fog had prevented us from seeing anything sooner. We made our way to it, and we found a small clearing, at the center of which a small bonfire was currently burning. Aside from the fire, the area looked like it hadn't been inhabited any time recently. The crackling of the fire was interrupted when a slightly more powerful gust of wind blew past us, and a creaking noise followed by a light knocking emanated from the opposite side of the fire, just past our severely limited field of vision. We made our way around the fire, and were taken aback when we found a roughly 6-foot-tall dollhouse standing at the edge of the clearing. The door of the dollhouse was open. The wind, causing its knob to knock against the face of the house. The darkness which lay beyond the doorway seemed to envelop our confidence in being out there, but we reasoned that if anything was inside, it was much smaller than we were. We approached the house and shined our lights inside, and found that just past the darkness, countless eyeless doll heads were stacked upon one another, from the floor to the ceiling, and wall to wall. As I was inspecting the house, Kimmy happened to flash her light towards the ground around the fire, and pointed out to me that there were hundreds of footprints, the size of which lined up with the myriad of blind dolls that now sat in the branches above us, and were scattered about the ground. I shut the door to the dollhouse and walked back over to the fire to observe the footprints for myself. And for a short moment, the crackling of the fire seemed to fade away, which gave way for a sound that made us turn white with fear. It was a baby crying in the distance. This time, neither of us had stepped on a doll. Then, a different pitch of crying began from a different location. Before long, babies crying in all different tones surrounded us in a cacophony of terror. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the fire died out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers and an uneven stream of smoke and ash being carried away by the wind. This prompted us to flee the area and make our way back to our car. The sounds of shrieking infants were joined by the now active mobiles, playing nursery rhyme tunes in horrific fashion, and both seemed to follow us all the way back to the dirt road on which our car was parked. We made it to the road, but came out of the woods at a different point than we had entered. So we had to wade across the road through the mess of strollers, cribs, and playpens to our car. But when we got to it, the area was still full of all those things. Where our car once sat unobstructed, now was surrounded by children's necessities, and an eyeless doll sat on the hood of our car. We opened the car doors and found the floor of our car to be covered in both dolls' dresses and random doll limbs. Without taking the time to clean the car out, we got in and I floored the vehicle into reverse, blasting through the cribs, strollers, and playpens. Once I had the room, I turned the car around and sped out of there like our lives depended on it. Before long, the fog had cleared up, and the road was unobstructed. We had only been in Babyland for about 15 minutes, but the experience took much more than 15 minutes away from our lifespans. After finally stopping and getting all of the doll paraphernalia out of our car, we drove through the night back to the safety of our own home. I now know why no one wanted to tell us about Babyland. It's because what happens there can't rightfully be explained. And it's for that same reason I'm not going to give any definitive information on its location. Anyone who ever asks me, be it the thrill-seeking community or otherwise, will never get any information regarding its whereabouts. I will never send anyone there. And I most certainly will never go back there myself. There is something very, very wrong about the place that they call Babyland. I love symmetry. I'm not sure exactly why, but I've loved it ever since I was a kid. Most children are messy and forgetful of their things. Not me, though. Oh no. I knew everything had its place, and in my room, everything was right where it belonged. My parents didn't have it. My grandparents didn't have it either. Not a single person in my family had it. I've started referring to it as it because I truly believe it's something inside of me. A stowaway that shouldn't be there but lives in my core. It's a need. A desire. A longing to be perfect. Perfect on both sides. As an adult, I'm at the point where I can't live my life normally. I can't keep a job. Women don't stay with me because they just can't handle it. Honestly, I don't even care when they leave. They're messy and they just make things so damn difficult. They roll over to my side of the bed instead of staying on their own side. They leave dishes in one side of the sink but not the other. I can't work anymore, so when they leave for the day, I have to stay home and fix everything. It's a relief when they leave for good, though. But that feeling never lasts. Eventually, it comes back and finds something else that needs fixing. You may be asking why. Why would I seek out relationships to begin with, if I simply can't stand them? Well, it's hard for me to sleep in the middle of my bed all night without moving. Other than the relationship problems, my life is pretty much in order. I say pretty much because there's one last issue that must be dealt with. You see, I have what's called heterochromia iridum, or 2 different color irises. My right eye, a cornflower blue. My left eye, a pale green. Both my parents have cornflower blue eyes. My siblings and cousins as well. My green eye is the broken one. It makes me unbalanced. Every time I look at myself in the mirror, it stares right back at me. It's all I ever think about now. Everything is in its right place, except my green little mistake. It didn't hurt at first when I dug the spoon underneath my eye. It didn't even hurt when it popped out and was just hanging by my cheek. Was it shock that was keeping the pain away, or was it? I snipped the optic nerve and blotted the warm fluids that were streaming down my face. My vision being cut in half was a strange sensation. What was left of the dangling flesh I placed back in the now empty socket. I bandaged the wound, rinsed the spoon, and went to sleep. I woke up happy. I slept better than I had in years. It was finally done. I was fixed. I got out of bed and I stumbled to the bathroom. My body ached and my head was on fire. I flipped the switch in the bathroom and the light was so blinding. Slowly, I removed the bandage that was soaked with blood and was sticking to my face like tape. When I looked up to the mirror, my stomach churned. Only then had I realized what I had done to myself. I couldn't believe it. There was a hole in the left side of my face, but not the right. I was unbalanced. Again. It was much harder digging out the second eye. My hands were shaky, and when I dug the spoon in, I missed several times, puncturing my pupil 3 times before I got it in the right place. Once the eye popped out, I reached for my scissors to finish the job. The blood from the previous night had dried on the blades, so my scissors didn't cut very well. You know when you were a kid in elementary school and your teacher made you cut construction paper for art projects? Did you ever try to cut too many pieces at once? And the scissors just couldn't take it. The blades would kind of fold over each other and the paper would get pinned between them. That's what happened with my eye. The optic nerve was pinned between the 2 blades. It was stuck. And as I tried desperately and frantically to make it unstuck, I slipped on the blood and started falling to the floor. My reflexes kicked in, and I let go of my eye to try to break the fall with my hand. The weight of the stuck scissors on my hanging eye was unbearable. I knew I couldn't stand it long enough to make it to the kitchen to get a knife, so I pulled. I pulled it straight out of my head. I felt the flesh tear from inside of my skull. I felt it rip and spew liquid everywhere. I knew I was crying, but there was no telling the tears from the blood from the ocular fluid. When I heard the wet slap of bloody flesh against the tile floor, I knew I was done. I knew it was done. I could live my life now without having to see people's awful, messy, uneven lives. The relief washed over me, and I knew it would last this time. I had never felt this way before. I never had this much hope. As I laid in my bathroom, on that cold, wet, sticky tile, I smiled for the first time in years. People often tell me fond memories of their very first apartment. They would say it's a great turning point in one's lifetime. I suppose I can see how some people would think that. A chance to move out of the nest and have a place to call your own. A personal sanctuary from the outside world. A safe place. For me, however, that wasn't necessarily the case. I had just recently graduated high school and was encouraged by my parents to seek out a new place to live. When I say encouraged, they basically told me to either pay rent or get out. Back then, I was nervous, but excited to finally branch out and find a place for myself. Although it seemed like I worked nonstop at my job making coffee, my paycheck limited my options on places to live. I spent months wading through locations. Some places were dirt cheap and it showed. However, bars on the windows made me feel less safe than their intended purposes, I'm sure. Other locations would have you inherit a small fortune to take up residence in their prestigious lodgings. It was beginning to feel like the more I searched, the bleaker my options became, until I stumbled across this complex on the edge of town. The rent was just within my range, and after doing a quick walkthrough, I was sold. The first month or so living there was actually fantastic. I have been told by family and friends that complexes usually make the apartment appear much nicer for the new tenant until they move in, and shortly after, all the problems start making themselves known. It wasn't until my second month that I started to pick up on the small issues that began to arise. For instance, the ceiling fan in my living room started to make a horrendous screech if it was left on for too long. The faucets would leak if you didn't turn the knob with the strength of 1,000 men. But I think the biggest annoyance I began facing was the issue in my bedroom. For some odd reason, my bedroom was the hottest room in my entire apartment. And no, I don't mean that as a pun. Simply walking from the living room to my bedroom felt like a transition from Arctic to desert. It didn't take me too long to surmise that the reason my room felt like the sun had to do with the air vent, located near the ceiling in my room. I walked over to it, raising my hand near the grate, and didn't even feel a single twinge of air emanating from it. I figured I would just contact the main office and request they send out a maintenance guy to solve the problem. However, when I phoned the front office, their previously kind demeanor seemed to shift once I finally became a tenant. It seemed like they completely stopped caring once they filled the vacancy. I was told that since the rest of my apartment had air conditioning, that it wasn't labeled an emergency, and that they would send someone out when it was convenient for them. Hearing that explanation almost sent me into a rage, but luckily I managed to hang up the phone before shouting obscenities at it. Once I was finally able to calm down enough, I took it upon myself to attempt to solve the problem. While I suppose it technically wasn't an emergency and I could have just slept in the living room, I wanted to check and see if it was an easy fix, such as opening the vent shutters. After retrieving a chair and climbing on it, I was finally able to get a good look at the vent itself. I wasn't surprised to find the vent shutters were open. There was just no air coming out of it. I'm not entirely sure what brought about this next series of thoughts, but my mind began to drift to the conclusion of a large animal stuck in the vents, like a raccoon or a nest of rats. These thoughts made my hands shake as I gently gripped the edges of the vent. With my eyes shut, I gave the vent a few swift tugs before it finally gave way and I almost lost my balance on the chair. A soft thud sounded from the ground beneath me as I could only imagine that the animal had fallen out of the vent. Opening my eyes, I checked the area below me. I was shocked and a bit confused by what I found that was tucked away in my vents. It was a cloth of some kind, which appeared to be wrapped around something. Picking it up and unraveling it, I discovered that it was in fact an old VHS tape. I'll admit, this was probably the last thing I expected to find inside the air vent. I had been so caught up in the mystery of what was in my vent that I hadn't even noticed the now ice-cold air blasting out of the unobstructed vent near my head. I placed the cover back onto the wall, hopped off the chair, and began inspecting the tape a bit more. There were no markings on it, or any indications that it belonged to someone. I'll be honest, I don't think I ever actually held a VHS tape in my hands, at least no times I can remember. I know that probably sounds sad to some of you, but we all come from different generations. If you think finding a VHS tape in your air vent is strange, you should try calling around town looking for a VCR. After hours of searching and phoning stores, I got lucky when a pawn shop I called happened to have one in stock. I made my way over to the shop immediately. I managed to get the VCR for around $40, which I probably overpaid for, but my curiosity was in desperate need of sating. I rushed home as quickly as I could, and spent almost an hour trying to hook up such an ancient device to my high-definition TV. At that point, the sun had fully descended. Once I had everything set up, I grabbed the tape, holding it for a moment while I thought about what might be on it. It had to be something good, I thought. Or why else would someone go to such lengths to hide it? I put the tape in the slot and waited for it to play. For around a minute or two, the screen on my TV showed nothing but static. The longer I watched, the more irritated I became at shelling out $40 that I could have spent on food. I was just about to press the eject button when the image suddenly changed. The TV flickered for a moment before an image of a woman appeared on the screen. The video was in black and white, but from what I could tell, the woman was sitting alone in a room. She had long dark hair that hung loosely over her face, and she wore a somewhat tattered white dress. My first impression of this tape was that someone had attempted to recreate the tape from the movie The Ring, and hid it away for some gullible person to find it and be terrorized by it. I smirked and mockingly said to myself, 7 days. Just then, the girl on the tape spoke. The audio was somewhat corrupted by the poor condition of the tape, but it sounded like she said, "Help me." Those words actually caught me off guard. I was expecting this woman to say something along the lines of, "I'm going to eat your face," or something to that effect. Hearing those two words completely changed my disposition towards her. I watched the film more intently and tried to make out what she was saying as best I could. Through the static, I could only make out a few vague statements. "He's going to kill us. I fear for my daughter. I've tried to seek help, but no one will listen." Even though the video was heavily distorted, I could almost feel the pain and fear this woman was going through. The tape continued for a few more minutes before she said one final thing. One thing that sent a jolt of ice throughout my body. "He's here." With that, the tape cut out and I was left in dark silence. I wasn't sure how to process all this information. I decided that it would probably be best if I just reported this to the police. The next morning, I made my way to the police station and informed them of what I had found. After reviewing the tape and questioning me, the detectives informed me that many years ago, a small family had just moved into a recently built apartment complex. After receiving a missing persons report, the detectives investigated the complex. When they arrived, they found a man living in the apartment. But when they inquired about his wife and kid, he simply told the police that they had an argument. She took the kid, left, and he hadn't seen her since. When the police went back a month later for follow-up questions, the entire apartment was empty and vacated, so the case was eventually closed. The police thanked me for this evidence and I was sent home. Shortly after that incident, I moved out of the apartment and moved back in with my parents. I decided that was the best option considering my situation.
I've always wondered why I happened to be the one person to find the tape. Surely others had lived in the apartment before me. Maybe the tape got jostled during the renovations before I moved in. Or maybe something else moved the tape. I'm not entirely sure.
People often have fond memories of their very first apartment. For me, the only thing I can think about is that woman probably died in the very spot I was watching the tape from. And that the man who killed her and probably their daughter is still alive and is still out there somewhere. It's hard to imagine what it's like to lose someone you love before it happens. Of course, I've seen it 100 times in the movies. Dramatic affairs for the most part, with lots of screaming and crying and carrying on. The shock, the disbelief, the unconstrained rage, all lashing out at the world for the most ordinary and predictable thing in it. It wasn't like that after Dad disappeared, though. He was simply there one day and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but a penetrating dull ache. Weeks of police investigation turned up nothing. It wasn't an act of cruelty which made the world steal him away. It was merely universal indifference. His life was short, his death random and meaningless, and there was nothing left but for the rest of us to carry on. I got the phone call from Mom late at night in my studio apartment. Dad was presumed dead, and the police had officially closed their investigation of him. I stayed quiet and listened to her all the way through, even though there was nothing left to say after the first line. I thanked her politely for letting me know, and then I hung up. After that, I stared at the wall for about an hour, not really thinking anything, just observing idle thoughts as they passed in one side and out the other. I live in a different state and hadn't seen him in a couple months. Eventually, I decided that waking up tomorrow wasn't going to be any different than every other day when he was still puttering around the kitchen table 1,000 miles away. But I was wrong. I had lived alone for years, but my apartment had never felt so empty before. I had to keep the TV on all the time just so I wouldn't have to hear the soft gurgle of blood in my veins or listen to the dull monotony of my own breath. I don't know how I never noticed those sounds before, but they were starting to drive me crazy now. I guess I just couldn't stop thinking about how fragile my own mortality was, and how pointless my life would have been if it were all to end. That's why I got a dog. Half husky, half coyote. About 6 months old. I picked her up from the animal shelter where some cowboy was dropping her off. The dog was growling and snarling at him, but she calmed down the instant he left. I figured she must have been abused or something, but she seemed so sweet to everyone else that I decided to take her home with me. A few days later, I got a call that my dad wasn't dead. A little over a month after he disappeared, he just showed up again. Mom said he just walked in one day and sat down at the breakfast table like nothing had happened. She couldn't get a word out of him about where he had been, but she was so happy to have him back that she just didn't even press. He wouldn't tell me anything either, just grunted something about needing to clear his head. It seemed like a miracle to me too. But I guess I had already spent so much time fixating on death that nothing much changed for me. I kept the dog anyway, and I named her Snoots. And from the very first time I called her that, her ears pressed flat with excitement, and she started wagging up a storm. She was really skittish at first, but she hated being alone, and would follow me from room to room, even sitting between my legs when I sat on the toilet. Snoots was absolutely perfect for me. Her constant attention made me feel like I mattered again. Maybe my life didn't matter in an existential sort of way, and maybe my death wouldn't mean anything on a cosmic scale, but it would mean the world to her. I was warned it might be hard to train her because of the coyote blood, but she learned almost everything immediately. She was so shy that she'd try to walk between my legs when a stranger was nearby, but it felt good knowing she trusted me. She did have one bad habit, though. Unpredictably going off. The first time was a couple months after I got her. We were walking down the sidewalk towards the park when her fur started to bristle, and her mouth flared to reveal powerful teeth. Before I knew what was happening, she was snarling, barking, and howling at the lady on the other side of the street. The lady started running, and Snoots actually lunged at the leash, almost dragging me into the street after her. As soon as the lady was gone, though, Snoots was back to normal. I couldn't figure out what had happened. She had never even growled at another animal before. The lady didn't have a dog with her, and she wasn't carrying food or anything. She hadn't made any threatening moves either. It was so random that I just forgot about it. But that wasn't the only time. The next time it happened, she jumped up from the couch and started snarling at the door. A few seconds later, someone knocked and she howled in response. I looked through the eye hole, but it was only the pizza guy. I had to actually drag Snoots into the bathroom and lock her in there until he left before she would calm down. That behavior happened so rarely that I couldn't figure out how to predict or prevent it. I couldn't just keep her isolated, and it was pointless to take her to training where she was usually the sweetest thing in the world. I was terrified that she would randomly attack someone and would be taken away from me, though. So I kept her daytime walks short after that, only going out in the early morning or late at night when there weren't so many people around. Another few months went by and I thought her feral side had finally been tamed, when it happened again. It was after 9 p.m. and we were doing a last walk through the park before it closed. I was talking to my mom and dad on the phone and wasn't really paying attention to Snoots snuffling along behind me. My first warning was when the leash snapped violently, ripping the phone from my hand. I automatically dove to catch my phone. Snoots was dragging so hard she managed to break the leash free from my grasp. I couldn't stop her from charging headlong into the darkness, a guttural snarling rising in her throat. I chased after her, shouting her name, screaming a warning for whoever was out there. But by the time I caught up with her, Snoots was already on top of someone. She had his hand in her mouth, savagely thrashing back and forth like she was trying to rip it off. The guy was trying to push her back, but Snoots kept lunging in at him whenever she lost her grip. By the time I caught up with him, she had her teeth around his neck, ferociously shaking like wild animals do when they're trying to make a quick kill. I got hold of the leash and pulled so hard Snoots practically did a backflip. The guy was on his feet now, swaying unsteadily. I started to apologize, but the words died in my mouth. His hand was a bloody pulp, severed digits scattered on the ground. The wounds on his neck were even more brutal. A whole sheet of skin was peeled back, hanging in ragged tatters along his shoulder. Part of his spine had ruptured straight through the side of his neck where it had been unmistakably broken. Exposed sinew glistened with blood as he slowly worked his neck in a long circle, like someone luxuriously stretching after a long nap. I didn't even know how he was still conscious, much less alive. I wanted to go back for my phone to call for help, But it took all my strength just to keep Snoots from diving back in to finish her prey. The man started fumbling at the ruined tatters of his neck, not taking his eyes off me. I braced myself, half expecting him to attack us right back in retaliation. He was too focused on his injuries, though. I was trapped in place holding Snoots back, helpless to turn away from what happened next. He grabbed the hanging folds of his skin with his good hand and started to peel it down the remainder of his neck. Then, he reached around to his back and started to peel it back there too. The whole mess of flesh flopping away like a diver getting out of a wetsuit. I watched, transfixed but mortified as he slid out of the rest of his skin and clothing to leave them both in a soggy pile at his feet. It wasn't exactly muscle underneath. It was more like a second skin, pale gray and slick with blood. But it was fitted so closely to the structures underneath that it mirrored the muscle fibers. I didn't have long to stare though. He was running as soon as he was free, leaving behind the whole wet mess he had shed on the ground. I ran home with Snoots as fast as I could. I didn't even go back for my discarded phone. I kept telling myself it wasn't real until I got back into my apartment. But it was much harder to lie to myself while I was washing the blood off of Snoots' face and fur. She was wagging her tail again, looking like her old self until she opened her mouth to let the last severed finger drop onto the floor. I couldn't be alone after that. Even Snoots wasn't enough company. I talked with Mom for a long time to help calm me down, although I didn't breathe a word about what had happened. She sensed that I was rattled though, and she convinced me to come back home and visit for a while. I kept Snoots with me, more afraid of the thing that discarded its skin than how she reacted to it. I have her locked in the car with me where I'm writing this now though. I want to run in and hug Mom and tell her how good it is to see her again. I want to ask Dad about what had happened, why he left, and why he decided to come back. But I can't get out of the car though. I can't let Snoots out. Not with her snarling since the moment I pulled up to my mom's driveway. There was only one thing that worked Snoots up like that, and I couldn't lie to myself and say it was something else. The only conclusion I could draw was that my dad may have really disappeared. But whatever came back was only pretending to be him. I left Snoots in the car and knocked on the door. I let out a long breath of relief when Mom opened the door. Then a hand fell on her shoulder, and the thing that looked like my dad popped into view. It made me sick to imagine the bloody slick gray skin underneath that intimate mask. It was one thing to lose my father, but having to look at him again like this was unbearable. They invited me in and I sat down, but I couldn't take my eyes off of him. The disguise was seamless, his affection genuine. Both of them avoided any mention of his disappearance, and I didn't bring it up either. I had to find some way of breaking the illusion though. I couldn't very well just sick Snoots on him and mangle him in the living room. I had to bide my time and wait until I could get him alone. I got my chance later that evening. Snoots was out back in the yard, still agitated and restless from her proximity to the creature. Mom was out at the store picking up some things for dinner. I invited Dad out to the yard to toss a football around like we used to. I figured we could take him by surprise and get rid of him before Mom came back. She'd just think he'd disappeared again. And if she could accept it once, then maybe she could accept it again. It was better than letting that thing live inside the house, watching her sleep, just waiting to make its move. I grabbed one of my dad's hunting knives and I waited just outside the door. I couldn't wait until Snoots started snarling or he might realize he was caught and get away. I had to strike hard and fast, and then Snoots could join me and help me finish the job. I tried not to think of that thing wearing my father's sweater as anything but a monster. I tried to tell myself it was the thing that had killed and replaced my real father. Anything to make it easier to do the deed, before the opportunity was lost. And then the door opened. He stepped outside, not noticing me pressed against the side of the house. I grabbed him from behind, not wanting to see his face, and I plunged the knife into his side, not wanting to let him speak. He lurched forward and I let go of the knife. I still couldn't look at him, so I ran to the yard to open the gate. "Now's the chance!" I shouted at Snoots. But she wasn't moving. Her fur was calm. She ran up to lick me and started wagging her tail. I had to drag her out of the yard, thrusting her towards the creature crawling on the ground. Snoots looked back at me, unsure of what to do. I almost thought I really had gone crazy until at last, the fur started to bristle down her back. She bared her fangs, hunching down in preparation to pounce. It wasn't until then that I noticed the sounds of tires on the gravel driveway on the other side of the house. Snoots wasn't paying my father any attention. It was my mother. Snoots was sprinting around the side of the house and I ran to keep up with her. Mom was just starting to get out of the car with an armful of groceries when the dog sprang at her. She managed to get the door closed in time, but Snoots wasn't giving up. Snoots beat herself against the window, snarling and slamming herself over and over into the car. My mom switched it into reverse, tearing back out of the driveway, out into the street to disappear around the block. I called an ambulance immediately, but Dad didn't look like he was going to last. Snoots came over to lick his face, but the blood wouldn't stop, and I didn't know what to do. He said that he didn't blame me for what happened, but every word was getting weaker than the last. I asked him why he had left, but I could have already guessed the answer. He had left when he found out Mom had been replaced by one of those creatures. "Then why'd you come back?" I had to ask him. I needed some closure before he was gone for good this time. "Because I still loved her," he said to me. "And that thing was the closest there is to having her back again." It was 4 months ago today when he first went missing. I remember the trust in my mother's eyes when she passingly said to me, "Keep an eye on Steven." We were just heading to the corner store a few blocks away and there was really no reason to be worried. I was always the responsible older brother, and we lived in a very safe neighborhood. But I am only 15 and I'm not perfect. I think back to that day often. There was a girl at school I had a huge crush on, and she happened to be walking through the parking lot of the convenience store. She looked at me and actually smiled. I talked to her for what was probably a few minutes, but it only felt like a brief moment to me. My 9-year-old little brother was the furthest thing from my mind. When she walked away, I remember looking longingly after her. Her perfume. It has just a hint of something, I thought to myself. That's what I was doing when he went missing. Trying to figure out what her perfume had the slightest hint of. But then I remembered my brother. I turned around in a panic, and he was gone. The next few days were a blur to me. I remember crying with my head in my hands while police officers asked me questions. I remember when his school closed down entirely and every student and teacher joined the search parties. I remember how, as the hours turned to days, we were no longer looking for my brother Steven himself, but for where his body might end up. But there was no trace of him. Anywhere. He had completely disappeared. My mother took his disappearance as badly as you might expect. She blamed me right from the beginning and would often shout at me, "You were supposed to be the man of the house. You were supposed to be there for your little brother. You were supposed to watch him." A 2-week period passed where she wouldn't speak to me at all. I would sometimes come home and see her on the couch curled up into the fetal position, shaking and crying. Even a month after he was gone, she would still sometimes walk the streets near the convenience store, shouting his name for hours on end. Things weren't much better for me. The guilt alone was difficult to deal with, and my mother's behavior didn't help. Teachers and students were nice to me at first, but I could see it in their eyes. They too blamed me for his disappearance. I was forever going to be that irresponsible kid who lost his little brother. I found myself sitting in my little brother's bedroom sometimes at night. It felt comforting for some reason, as though I was nearer to him. I would walk around the house and look at his popular hiding spots from when we used to play hide and seek. A dark corner in his closet was his favorite spot. I found myself looking there often, somehow expecting him to just be there. "Steven, where are you?" I'd whisper. I half expected him to answer back, but he never did. After 3.5 months, my mother and I had all but given up on finding my little brother. Things had improved a little bit, and my mom was speaking to me again, but it was obvious that things would never be the same between us. We were already starting to speak of Steven in the past tense. "Steven is such a good kid," got replaced with, "Steven was such a good kid." The police and the town in general were very active in the search for Steven for the first week, but it had slowed down considerably. I didn't think the police were really looking for him at all any longer, which is why it caught us by such a surprise when the knock came from the front door. I looked out the window and saw 3 police cars. The walk down the hallway felt like slow motion. I ever so slowly opened the door, expecting the worst. An officer looked down at me, but there was actually a hint of a smile. He was holding the hand of a little boy. My brain couldn't immediately process it. I realized it's a pretty strange reaction given the circumstances, but I was sort of functioning on autopilot. "Oh, hey Steven," I said. "Hi," he replied. And then the 3 of us just stood there in awkward silence. I don't know how long it would have lasted, but it was broken by a piercing scream from behind me. My mom crashed down the stairs, shrieking all the while, and grabbed Steven. She spun him around, touching his head and shoulders, as though she didn't really believe he was real. Then she picked him up, clutching at him, and started crying. Steven was also crying at this point. And then the reality of the situation finally sunk in for me, and I grabbed a hold of them as well. The 3 of us crying in each other's arms. We were whole again. We were a family again. It ended up being the best scenario possible, given the circumstances. The man who kidnapped Steven wasn't a pervert or a violent psychopath. He was a lonely man, whose own wife and son had died in an accident a couple years ago. He had partly lost his mind in his depression. Steven was his replacement son, and was treated well the entire time. It was the kidnapper himself who turned himself in. After 3.5 months, he could no longer deal with the guilt of what Steven's real family was going through. Given all that, it's surprising how quickly we fell back into old routines. He's only been back for 10 days, but it was like Steven had never really gone missing at all. For the most part, Steven was perfectly fine as well. other than he had difficulty sleeping. He would often come into my bedroom in the middle of the night and wake me up. Sometimes we just talked. Sometimes we played video games. Sometimes he would just go back to bed on the couch next to me. But then something strange happened last night. There was a huge thunderstorm outside. And at about 2 a.m., Steven came into my room. He said that he couldn't sleep and wanted to play Xbox. I didn't mind. It was the least I could do after all. The storm was getting pretty bad, and sometimes the light would flicker a little bit. I looked at my brother. You know, Steven, I've never apologized about that day. I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. He stopped playing, and he looked at me. He was right about to speak, but then the power went out. We were in complete darkness. And maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me, but I could see a faint, shadowy outline of my brother, and it looked as though his limbs were bending and moving in impossible ways. He was hunched over, moving around the room in jittery-like motions. Steven, I said aloud. And that's when it happened. My skin crawls just thinking about it. It was not my brother's voice that answered me. It was a grown man's. And it sort of echoed. It didn't even sound human.
I am not Steven,
he said. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness better, and I could see a little bit clearer. It looked as though his legs were wrapped up over his head, and he was somehow moving on the ground with his hands. He was moving closer to me. And then, the lights came back on. In an instant, Steven was back to normal. I asked Steven what the heck happened, but he just denied everything. He claimed he didn't say a single word in the dark, and that he didn't even move. He then said he was tired and was just going to go back to his bedroom. But then, something even stranger happened as he left. He stood at my bedroom door and looked back at me. Vanilla, he said. What? I replied. Her perfume. It had just a hint of vanilla. And then he closed the door. So, I have no real idea how to proceed here. I never told anybody about the perfume. How could he possibly know what I was thinking when he went missing? And the bending of his limbs. Him speaking in a man's voice. Him denying that he even is Steven. I can't tell my mom. Hell, she wouldn't believe me anyways. And she's been so happy ever since he returned. I really have no idea what to do. I think I believe the voice I heard in the dark. That boy is not my brother Steven. I don't know who or what he is, but I'm going to find out. And for the real Steven out there, if you're even listening to this, that is, I'll find you, buddy. I promise. I'm going to find you. When I was 9, I developed a fear of the dark. When I say fear of the dark, I don't just mean thoughts of ominous creatures lurking in the shadows waiting to pounce on me. I was more so consumed by the thought of being lost forever, in an endless black. Walking endlessly with no bearings or light guiding your way, until eventually collapsing from your own exhaustion. I didn't always have this fear, and this fear is unique in that being outside at night, or even sleeping in my own bed doesn't bring about the dread-filled panic I've come to know. The first time I felt it, I was a little boy playing with some friends at a friend's house. We were running around, pretending to be superheroes, and fighting against the one of us unlucky enough to be the villain. While we were playing, the villain happened to sneak up on me and tag me, exclaiming, "I got you. You're my prisoner now." To which I replied, "You'll never get away with this." For a 9-year-old, my acting was fairly good. We stood side by side for a moment while the other heroes debated on how to rescue me. In the meantime, the villain told everyone that I was to be taken to the dungeon, to wait until the heroes were dealt with. The dungeon was the basement. It wasn't much of a dungeon, but that was what the villain decided. I was quickly ushered through the door to the steps, and then the villain slammed the door shut behind me. As soon as the door closed at my back, I froze. Rapidly, the light from the doorframe faded away, and I was left on a staircase in utter darkness. Now, I had seen my friend's basement before. We had spent multiple days playing down there and exploring. But this time was different. As the darkness enveloped me, I began to feel sweat dripping from my face. My breathing was becoming shallow. I wasn't sure what was wrong, but I knew I needed to get out of that place immediately. I quickly spun back around and tried to bang on the door. When my fist flew through the air, I felt my body lurch forward. The door that I had previously entered was no longer in front of me. I took a step, reaching out. Somehow there was still solid ground beneath my feet. I took another, frantically waving my hands in every direction. My shallow breathing was slowly turning into hyperventilation as I shuffled faster and faster. Usually, a person's eyes adjust to the darkness, if only to the point of making out shapes. But mine didn't. I was completely shrouded, as if I had gone blind. At that point, I began to have a breakdown. Tears were streaming down my face, melding with the sweat from my brow. I called out for help, and my voice was carried for a moment before dying out. It's hard to put into words how terrifying that situation was for me. Maybe the only people who could relate would be minors, but even they could feel the walls which surrounded them. I continued forward, calling out once again, before suddenly I fell forward into a blinding white light. I was surrounded by all my friends looking at me with confused expressions, each wondering why I was a mess of tears and panic. I told them nothing, only that I needed to leave now. My childhood friends and I slowly drifted apart, and I didn't have another episode like that until my senior year in high school. One of my classmates was throwing a seniors-only house party and I was invited. Normally, I didn't much care for stuff like that, but I promised the girl I had a crush on that I would go, so I did. I didn't arrive until later that evening. At that point, everyone was mostly drunk already. When I got there, my classmate greeted me with a drunken hello and demanded I go get a beer, that I needed to catch up. At the risk of being berated by a house full of drunk teenagers, I nodded. He told me all the beer was in a fridge in his garage. I sighed and made my way through the door which connected to the garage itself. Opening the door, I could see the garage was quite dark, but I could distinctly see the fridge on the other wall. I took a few steps in and the weight of the door slammed itself shut. Thoughts of my 9-year-old self flooded back into my mind as everything vanished in front of me, as if a black hole had opened and all of reality was sucked in. Everything, except for me. I tried not to get worked up as I told myself I was just a kid back then, and that I'm almost an adult now. I just needed to walk to the wall, find the fridge, grab a beer, and leave. Easy. So I walked, and walked, and walked. At some point, I knew I had walked much farther than the length of the garage, and that's when the feeling of panic slowly started to settle in again. I then remembered that I had my phone, and that I could just use the light from my phone to show my way. When I retrieved it from my pocket, I clicked the button, but nothing happened. The screen didn't glow. which was impossible because I knew I had charged my phone before coming to this party. My next reaction was to break out into a sprint. I ran as hard as my legs could take me. The echoes from my footfalls died out seconds after they sounded. It was like I was trapped in a dream. At one point, I thought it might be the case, so I slapped myself in the face and pinched my arms. Nothing seemed to wake me from this nightmare. Eventually, my sprint turned into a jog, which turned into walking. I could feel my strength leaving my body with each step. I shouted into the darkness for my friends, for anyone to help me. My breathing once again became shallow, though this time it was probably more from the fatigue than the fear. But trust me, the fear was still there. When I could no longer walk any further, I took a deep breath and I screamed as loud as I possibly could. Suddenly, a light bathed the entire room, blinding me for a moment. It seemed like the entire house had come to the garage to see what was wrong. When I could finally see again, I found myself standing face to face with a refrigerator. That's when the drunken laughter came in, followed by police sirens. Apparently, the drunk teenagers weren't the only ones to hear my scream. Some neighbor heard it too and called the cops. I was forever branded as the guy who got a party busted and got the host of that party in a lot of trouble. To say I was never invited out after that was an understatement. The last time this happened, I was at work. I work at a fairly busy call center during the day. Hell, all of my activities are during the day now. I never leave my bedroom after the sun goes down. I sleep until morning, and over the years it has worked out pretty well for me. Anyways, it was just another average day at work. A storm had recently came in, which made me nervous. I usually try to stay home during bad storms, but this one was only supposed to be a light rain, which turned into a thunderous downpour. I finished my work for the day, shut down my computer, and quickly made my way out of the office. In a poorly thought out decision combined with my desire to get home as quickly as possible, I stepped into the elevator. I pressed the lobby button and the door slowly closed. About halfway down, the power went out. When that light bulb extinguished itself, I felt a sudden jerk from the elevator stopping. I was once again brought back to those previous times. Sweat beaded on the sides of my face as I reached out to where the buttons once were. A part of me wished they were still there, but the whole of me knew they weren't anymore. I called out to the darkness in a timid whisper and stood my ground. Not because of bravery, mind you, but because I knew it would be fruitless to waste energy. I sat down and began waiting. I knew that eventually someone would get the power back on and the elevator would open once again. Just then, I heard something. It scared me to hear a noise in this place. It sounded like a man calling out in the distance. It was distorted and faint at first, but as time passed by, I could make out a man calling out for help. I stood up and shouted to the darkness, asking if he could hear me. I didn't expect a response, but the voice asked me where I was. I told him to keep talking and that I would come to him. I started walking towards his shouts. The closer I got, the more the voice sounded familiar to me. When I got to the voice, I still couldn't see anything in front of me. I asked him how he ended up here, and for a moment there was no response. For a moment I thought the voice was just a figment of my own imagination. Then he spoke as if he was right next to me. It feels like I've been here for years. I don't remember how I got here. At that moment I realized that the voice I was hearing was my own, albeit a bit older. Suddenly, the light washed over me and I was standing in the elevator drenched with sweat and staring at a bunch of confused office workers. I'm currently writing this from my car as I'm too terrified to go anywhere else. I'm not sure when it will happen again, but I do know one thing. It's going to happen again. And even though I'm terrified of the dark, I'm more scared of the fact that I might be in a place where no one will find me for a very long time. This seemed like a good place to put this. Any forthcoming explanations would be very welcome. Me and a few buddies of mine live in Tennessee, close to the path of totality for this latest eclipse. A very rare lifetime event and whatnot. We decided to go to a fishing hole we knew about, out in the backwater, and watch the eclipse from there. It was a long drive out, and if you've ever been in the back roads of the South, you know there was nothing around but farms, trees, and the odd gas station near us. Hundreds of people swarmed Tennessee, just to get that perfect view of the eclipse. But, as popular as it was, there were no out-of-towners in sight of the fishing hole. It might be important to note that the fishing hole hosts a small Trail of Tears memorial, with the trail just brushing the land we walked on. We passed the stone monument on our way down to the hole. It mentioned with sober brevity the removal of the Cherokee from their native land, and the tragedies that occurred in its wake. Thousands dying, or having their loved ones die, besides the fact that they lost their home their people had lived on for millennia. At the time we glanced at it, each of us paid our private respects, and moved on to fishing and eclipses. Thinking what I do now, I wish maybe we had done more, but really, who else would have? The time passed like any other day out fishing. We tangled some lines, snagged a few logs, caught nothing, and were generally having a good time. Towards the afternoon, the dark shape of the moon started to encroach upon the sun. We sat back and enjoyed the view for a bit. We hardly noticed it until it had happened. The woods went quiet. Birds, flies, fish, not even the cicadas. Can't get them to shut up for anything in the summer, day or night. Even they had quieted. It was like the sound around us had been suffocated. That's the best way I think I can describe it. We knew a lot of freaky stuff went down during an eclipse. It was unsettling, but to be honest, it was also very exciting. We were getting the full show. Eventually, we too quieted. I guess the feeling was mutual. The moon crept over the sun's face. The world got darker around us. Colder. Colors and weird shadows split across the ground, like an artist's palette. It was truly breathtaking. I was switching between my light-resistant glasses and the landscape around me. Sun, woods, sun, woods. Finally, the moon was full, and only the sun's halo shone behind it. I removed my glasses to see it better. Then they were there. They were like reflections and shadows. It's hard to explain. Projected around us. Standing all around us. Dark, humanoid shapes. There was no sound. No movement. With the glasses on, you would have never even known they were there. There were hundreds of them. In the woods. Behind the trees. At the shoreline. In the water. On top of the water. Like silhouettes. Only round. Palpable. Real. I can almost swear I could tell which were men and which were women. If that's what they even were. When the reality set in, I screamed and fell out of my chair. My friends ripped their glasses off and shot up out of their chairs as well. We were surrounded. The closest one to us was less than a yard away. Nobody said a word. My scream seemed to echo throughout the woods, between the still figures. Silently, we all stood up and grouped together, back to back. They still hadn't moved, made a sound, made any sign that they were even alive. We all started moving towards the truck, all huddled together. One of my friends had drawn out his hunting knife, which felt about as useful as a stick. And suddenly, just as quickly as they had arrived, they all vanished. The moon moved off of the sun, and the figures faded, like mist in the morning, right before our eyes. The whole ordeal had lasted less than 3 minutes. We got out of there as fast as we could. I think it's safe to say that'll never happen to me again. Still, I'm curious. Did any of you out there experience something strange or unusual during the eclipse?